Hey guys, thanks for joining me back at Middle Class Reactions. Just a heads up today, I'm not feeling super good. Got into some stuff at work that has me feeling kind of down. So keep the mic muted unless I'm talking about something. So sorry about the sniffles and the rough voice. So this is the follow-up debate that Dave Smith had with John Speencer. He's a professor. I'm not sure where. I wonder if let me see. Uh, Executive Director of Urban Warfare Institute. So, Mr. Fancy Pants, this is this is the guy who's supposed to know all the things. One of them, anyway. So, yeah, let's take a listen.
Smith one camp. You tweeted, Dave Smith and Douglas Murray debated who qualifies as an expert and who should be making declarative statements about certain wars. That question answers itself. And that's been construed, John, to mean that you believe that Dave Smith was not the expert in the room. Explain why you felt that Dave Smith lost this debate.
Sure. I wouldn't say it had anything to do with Douglas. I would have to say it was the statements that Dave Smith made during the podcast, which highlight, and I won't get into the credentialism as Dave's quoting four-star generals or who's an expert, who's not. I do research. I think Dave tells jokes for a living.
Okay, so in one sentence he says, I'm not going to get into credentialism, and then immediately follows that up with, I do research and Dave tells jokes for a living. So when you're listening to a debate, you can automatically tell who's going to be a good faith debater and who's not. And statements like that, you immediately know he's not here for a good faith debate. That's all he's trying to do when he's saying stuff like that is degrade Dave Smith. But to just openly, on one sentence say, I'm not going to get into credentialism, and then instantly follow that up with, well, I do research and Dave Smith tells jokes. It's crazy to see it out like just blatant, but Douglas Murray did the same thing. So here we are.
I had a problem with the statements you were made, and then how do you come to that conclusion, which really does get to the podcaster world versus other individuals on how did you come to that opinion or that declarative statement? Like Israel is intentionally killing civilians. There's like 10 different ways you can do research. You can do comparative, case study. And I think this is what Douglas was saying. If you haven't been there, then how are you getting to your conclusion? You ethnographic, you can go there and do interviews in Gaza like both Douglas and I have done with soldiers. What's going on? How are you doing it? You can do even historical art.
You notice that in those in those interviews, they never go talk to any people who live in Gaza. They never go talk to any Palestinians. They never try to get in and go talk to a Hamas fighter to see if they'll even do it. No. Like in Douglas's case, he got sent on a BBC-paid trip to Israel that was led by Israel. And then talks to the people that Israel wanted him to talk to. Then he's going to, and I don't know about John Speencer. I don't know, so I can't say, what his was paid for or self-funded. I don't know. I know Douglas Murray's instance it was not. But yeah, it's just crazy.
Archival data, research. That's not what it appears that Dave does, and it seems to be more of a historical revisionism. Take a piece of data that you got and then tell a really convincing narrative on how you got to your conclusion. But as somebody who has students, correlation is not causation is that famous phrase. When that story is actually just a lot of correlation and inferences, how did you get to your conclusion? How do you do that research?
By the way, which is wrong? I will die on the hill. Correlation can equal causation. Very much can. Pretending like it doesn't is wrong.
Forget the expertise and the credentialism. You're making a statement like it's true, and I know Dave's anti-war, and that's great, but you can't be anti-factual, and Dave, without Douglas, just made a bunch of not true statements.
Now, I may be about to shock you with this.
Talking over X.
Those which are literally used in your mouth. Go to Van literally in /discount/Piers. Well, give some of the key examples of what you think were completely factually inaccurate.
Absolutely. So, I think the over one, which is what me and Dave were talking over X, is that Israel is intentionally killing civilians, especially children. That's not a factual statement at all, because it doesn't even include the base information. So it's almost like, you just don't know the information you need to know to make that judgment. And, let's forget comparing it to a domestic situation like Dave continues to do on Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, others. Like, if somebody killed my kids and I know where he's at, and I go to that apartment building and I kill everybody in it, that's murder. And that's what Israel is doing. And that's not true. Even you, Piers, have commented about Israel striking something and saying, look at the number of civilians, that's not acceptable. That's not how war works. It's not even how you would assess that situation, because it completely rules out what the law of war says about proportionality, about assessing what is the target, who is that individual, what's his value, concrete value, and then, which a lot of people leave out, is what precautions did Israel take, like we just saw recently, of calling everybody in the building saying, look, the terrorist is using this building for a military purpose. You must leave. You must get out of this area, or all the other steps, these civilian harm mitigation measures. So that one's a really huge one, but there are other ones, like when Dave said that there are more children to have died in this war than any modern war. That's just, of course, Douglas called that out, but there is a whole list of them, from the blockade, from the occupation. Like, all of these things were just counterfactual and not a logic that leads to a conclusion, but he's really convincing, and that's what I have a problem with.
All right, Dave, your response.
Sure. Well, okay. I mean, I do think that, like, you do a lot of this, as Douglas did, a lot of this poisoning of the well stuff and saying you tell jokes and I do research, and you could say this isn't credentialism all you want to, but it's really a lot before you start taking on an actual argument. In fact, it wasn't until the follow-up question that you pointed anything out. So to the analogy that I'm making, and as you were quoting me on Twitter the other day, I'm not saying that I'm not familiar, although I'm not claiming to have your level of expertise with international humanitarian law, or you can assert that war works a different way. I'm talking about something much more fundamental. What I'm saying is that Douglas is making the claim, and many others are, that Israel's killing of civilians is unintentional. And I'm talking about a very basic philosophical concept of morality, of intentionality, and that by what people mean when they say intentional, that if this was done domestically, we would consider it intentional.
Forgot to unmute my mic. Sorry about that. You have people. One of these is like, it's really interesting because you have people like John Speencer, who is arguing from a much more governmental point of view, and you have people like Dave Smith, who's much more arguing from a people's perspective, and that's why the Ukraine and Russia, or Israel Hamas, or whatever it is, those two wars are. You generally have looked at it from a governmental perspective and the people's perspective. And the way John Spencer's arguing here is very, very much, well, are the casualties worth it? Is this guy worth killing XYZ number of civilians? Et cetera, et cetera. Where Dave Smith, he's about to make the point where it's like, hey, that doesn't change the fact that, like, you purposely did it. But take a look and see what Dave says.
The point is that war, yes, look, there's been the Geneva Convention, there's international humanitarian law. It goes back to the mid-19th century, was codified into law after World War II. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a step in the right direction. But this is all a politician or a group of politicians declaring a word, and the fact that there are lines drawn on a map does not in any way magically transform morality or the basic philosophical concept of intent. And even in your example there, if I were to give out pamphlets, give out a warning, tell everybody I'd really like you to leave, and then they didn't, and I blew up a building, we would consider that intentional murder. Now, my point, I think a lot of times people object to almost what the implications of this way of looking at the world might be, but forget all all of that for a second. I'm just talking about how human beings think about these things. And when you talk about an intentional killing, now, by the way, I should also stipulate that it's not as if that's the case in every single one of these strikes that Israel's taken. And we've gotten all types of evidence about this. And there's quite a number of cases, hundreds of cases, where they're waiting for terrorists to go back into a residential building and then attacking the building, suspected terrorists, I should say. But regardless, none of this is even really the point. The point is that on a very basic human level, and I would also think this is completely incompatible with Christianity, although I'm not trying to lecture anybody about that, but there is no micro and macro morality. There is no micro and macro intentionality. These are human concepts. And if you are dropping a bomb and you know that there are women and children on the receiving end of that bomb, then that was done intentionally. And I think this is the reality of war. And I think if we're going to have a conversation about this, we should deal with it in reality.
You see, that, and that's what I mean. Dave is coming at this much more from how normal, everyday people look at it. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the government just can't figure out, and it's the same with Russia, Ukraine, why they can't figure out why so many people are against this. You know, because they're not looking at it from a, well, you know, this general, he's worth killing these 200 civilians that are in that building because he's a general. Whereas most, I'd say at this point, most, even if it's not most, even if it's 50-50 split, you know, are looking at this going, yeah, but you just killed 200 people. And I know my views on this have really changed the last year and a half, where it's like, if I put myself in the Palestinian shoes on this, and I can do this with Israel too, but if I put myself in the Palestinian shoes on this, like, I don't have any kids, but I have a niece. She's about to be 6 or 7. If I was a Palestinian and say China was doing to us what we're allowing Israel to do to Gaza, you know, and say China drone striked her school because there was one of the teachers were a terrorist, and it killed her in the process, right? But then the government was like, hey, that was a terrorist that was in that, you know, in that school. I would scorch the earth. Like, it wouldn't matter who got in my way. I would scorch the earth. Now you multiply that over thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people over the last 6 decades. You can kind of see where, and I'm not talking Hamas here, because Hamas is a different thing, but the Palestinians themselves, you can kind of see how they could at least get radicalized, you know? And like I said, I could do the same thing with Israel. If I had a kid who was there, if my niece was there on October 7th at that concert, you know, say she was 16, 17, she was at that concert and Hamas killed her, I would feel the same way. Scorch the earth. Wouldn't care. You know? I think people kind of forget to look at things from that perspective. And I think that's why the government has a hard time realizing why so many people are against this.
Yeah, and also, John, I'll get you to respond to that. But I mean, it just seems to me, having done so many debates about this since October the 7th, I've never disputed that Israel had a right to defend itself. In fact, a duty to defend itself and its people from any further attacks of that magnitude, given how horrific it was. So let me just restate that again. But there's a kind of unique battlefield in Gaza. I would argue, and maybe you would argue differently, that you've got 2 million people, 50% of whom are under 18. And that the enemy are all living in civilian areas amongst the civilians. So you have a kind of horrific battleground, if you like, to attack if you're Israel, in the sense that you can only constantly kill a lot of civilians, including children, if you go after the enemy in those civilian areas. And that's exactly what's happened. And I can't think of a similar war, and maybe you can, you're more experienced at this, I accept, than I am, but can you think of another scenario where the proportion of children that is in the attack zone has been at 50% or higher, and therefore we're seeing so many children being killed?
So, look, yeah, that's the case study or comparative model that you could do the research on. How does this compare to anything else? And it doesn't, right? The 20 years of preparing Gaza for war, the 400 miles of tunnels, the human sacrifice strategy, because both sides actually have legal obligations. And when Hamas says, I need the death of my women and children, that's not right. So the data about what is the population. So one, I don't want to be heartless about it. In every death of a child,
they're about to say some heartless things when they start the sentence off by, I don't want to be heartless about it, but they're about to say something awful. Watch this.
Is terrible. But you're evaluating anybody who's below the 18 as a child. As in, that Hamas has basically charged. I joined the military at 17. Am I a child? And Hamas deploys. The average age of a Hamas recruit right now is 16 and a half. We've seen them put weapons in hands of very young children. You have combatant and you have non-combatant. Is there any comparable status to the demographic of Gaza? No. Is there any comparison to where another country, Egypt, refuses to let even those that want out from the combat areas, and Israel, who took weeks to evacuate the civilians from the areas they're going into? So absolutely, there are so many here. But back to Dave's comment, which it stands on itself, explaining what he doesn't know about war or the laws of war, about them being codified and when they went into effect. Or this is a simple question of morality that war should be no killing of civilians. That should be it. You two military should go find your place to fight and just have it out.
It's not at all what Dave said. I don't know why they do this so much, which is, it's like they'll create an argument, and Douglas did this too. They create an argument that Dave didn't make, and then argue that point. I hate when they do that.
That's not the history of war from the creation, literally, of city-states going out and everything.
Again, I think
you want to get into the frameworks to judge. No, the frameworks to judge war. We as societies, all the societies of war, the Geneva Conventions is one example, have decided here are the boundaries of brutality of war. Like, we don't bomb.
Fun fact, the Geneva Convention, the main reason it was created was the bombing of Dresden, which Churchill ordered. Fun fact.
Innocent civilians. And you cannot say, I don't care what your Haaretz articles say, you're not going to show me that Israel has targeted civilians intentionally killing civilians, when I can show you measures that Israel has taken that no military in the history of war have taken to get civilians out of harm's way so they can target that terrorist. You once said on a podcast.
So it's kind of funny that he just forgets to bring up that like early in the war, if you remember, they were telling everyone, hey, go to Rafa. And then, Israel bombed Rafa. It's kind of funny that he's forgetting that little coinkydink. Or the fact that they just found, was it 12 or 13 marked Red Cross humanitarian aid workers that the IDF killed, then buried. Leaving that kind of stuff out, which is kind of a interesting detail to not point out,
If the terrorist is holding a baby and shooting at you, then of course you can kill the terrorist. And unfortunately, what they're doing is wrong. But then I understand that when we have cases of Hamas doing that, holding children so nobody will shoot at them, or going underneath a hospital, a school, a mosque, doing what we call lawfare, you have to have an understanding of the evolutions of the law of war, how it is adjudicated. When you say evidence, I mean evidence, not TikTok videos. I mean actual evidence.
See, he does that thing again where it's like, I'm talking about evidence, not TikTok videos, like Dave is talking about TikTok videos. Just such a bad faith way to argue, man.
Evidence of what did the person dropping the commander know? What did he do to prevent it? What time did he do it? What type of munition did he use? Dave's statement stand on his own of showing that he doesn't know the foundations of war, even if it's what you call a just war or just execution of the war. You're just not communicating that you know enough to make a statement like that. I'm just philosophically talking about killing civilians is wrong. That's what the law of war says. It says don't target civilians. Yeah. What Hamas did on October 7th. It doesn't say 0 civilians will die in a war. There's the precaution law of war. There is the feasible things you do to prevent the civilian death. But you can't say Israel hasn't done that. And I'm saying, based on my research, not an appeal to expertise, going there, interviewing IDF soldiers, commanders.
his whole argument has been an appeal to expertise. He started the debate off with saying, I do research and you tell jokes. His whole argument's been an appeal to expertise.
Netanyahu himself, I'm saying Israel is not targeting or intentionally trying to kill civilians. They're doing the opposite more than anybody else.
Piers Morgan Uncensored is now proudly independent. If you like the show, we ask that only one point John made, and obviously respond to everything, or text Piers to 655. But the last point about he's been there, you know, one of Douglas Murray's attack lines with you was that unlike him, who regularly goes to Israel, he regularly goes to Ukraine, you don't go to these places that you then opine on. You know, personally, I don't think you need to go to the sun to know it's hot. But, you know, a lot of people agree with Douglas Murray and say, yeah, you know, actually he's right. If you don't actually go, how can you really know what you're talking about? And John's kind of inferring that as well. What do you say to that?
No, Piers, I'm not inferring that you have to go there. I'm saying, what research methodology are you using? If you're not doing interviews of people involved in the actions, if you're not collecting data.
Again, keep in mind, when they keep saying that they're talking to people involved in the actions, they're talking to one side of this argument. You know, that'd be like if I went out, and this is something I'm going to be doing here soon, where I'm going out to these protests and talking to people, but I only went and talked to the Republican side, just got their perspective, and then was like, yeah, I talk to people at protest, I know what they think, so therefore I can talk about it. It's just it's so dishonest, man.
In a certain way, which you can get from going there. You can do ethnographic research by interviewing the people involved in the execution. I'm not saying that straw man of, well, Dave's not been there, so he can't talk. If Dave did research, then absolutely. If Dave didn't have giant logical holes in what he's saying, like about the blockade or about the bombing or things like this, then you don't have to go there. There are many ways to do research. I'm saying Dave doesn't do that.
Okay, so I'll say, Piers, it's both. I feel like both in this debate and in the debate with Douglas Murray, it almost kind of feels like the analogy I'd use is like if two fighters agreed to fight. You know, two guys in the UFC, they agree to fight, and so they show up under the lights, and you get into the cage, and I put my hands up, and then the other guy puts his hands down and starts telling me what a better fighter he is than me. And you're like, okay, well then let's do it. Like, I don't know, let's have the conversation. Like, instead of all this time just telling me you're an expert. Hold on, wait 1 second. Let me finish my point since you had some time to talk there. Look, all of this stuff about like whether you have to be there. By the way, it's going viral online, but there's this great clip of Douglas Murray taking apart the lived experience argument from the left and making all these points about how people who were never in the Holocaust have written much more beautifully and accurate about the Holocaust than people who actually went through it themselves. If you want to say that you gain some, if you want to say you have expertise, or you want to say going there gives you some more expertise, then sure. I mean, I wouldn't argue that. No one's arguing that you can't learn about a place from going there. But again, this is the fighter putting his hands down and going, I've trained so much harder than you. I'm such a better boxer than you. You could never hang with me. It's like, okay, so let's get it going. Anyway, in terms of, by the way, there is absolutely no chance, and I haven't examined Douglas Murray's passport, but there's no chance that he's not a hypocrite on this issue. I guarantee he has not been to all of the places that he's commented on. I don't know. He's commented on every foreign country and what's going on geopolitically for 20 years. I'm sure he hasn't visited all of those places. Back to the point, because it seems like in these things we do everything except actually debate the issue. You missed my entire point. Once you're appealing to the law or appealing to how warfare actually works, you're missing the entire point that I was making. My point is that this is not how the law works, and this is not how war actually works. I'm making a much more basic human point, a fundamental point. Look, Piers, the other day, okay, this is, and by the way, if you don't want to believe this story, it's fine. It's just one firsthand account from Gaza. But whether it's true or not, and there's no reason to suspect it's not true, but whether it's true or not, there's just been hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of examples like this. But so there was a woman, building collapsed. She says, as she's walking down the building, she can hear the little kids not 16-year-old members of Hamas. You're talking 4 and 5-year-olds screaming for their mothers while they're buried underneath the rubble, screaming for help from their mommy. And you know what, Piers? No help is coming because there's no bulldozers in Gaza. Nobody's coming to get those kids out. This is the reality of war. And this is what this is the main point that I was trying to make to Douglas Murray, which he kept running away from. If you're going to say that our goal here is to degrade Hamas, Murray conceded you probably can't eliminate them, but he feels like you can degrade them. If you're going to
not only can you not eliminate them, their numbers now estimated are roughly back to where they were pre-October 7th. That's the funny thing. That's according to Israel. So obviously what's happening right now is not working.
Degrade Hamas, and the cost of it is those little children dying under rubble, screaming for their mother as their bones are crushed and no one's coming to help them, then fine. But at least say that you find that price acceptable. And then we could have a real conversation about why people are going to view you as a monster and why the other side will never stop fighting and will always be against you. Because I could tell you for sure, if that was my kids, and I know, Piers, if those were your kids as well, you wouldn't want to hear anything about how, well, we've codified in international law that this is the norm of the way wars are allowed to be fought versus not allowed to be fought. I'm making a very human point that this is the reality of war. And you can say under international humanitarian law, it's not considered intentional. We would consider this an intentional act in any other area. That's the point. It's a very basic human point that if anyone were to do this domestically and then tried to use the defense of like, no, but I dropped a leaflet. No, I didn't really want to kill them. I just wanted to kill them. We'd go, I don't care. You blew up a building knowing there were kids in there. That's the essence of this whole thing. And there's no amount, there's no amount of expertise that can really get you away from this basic fundamental moral logic.
And that right there is exactly what I mean. Again, Dave's arguing from a person's, the normal people's perspective versus the guys like John Speencer here who's arguing it from a governmental point of view. You know, it's interesting to see the two opposing sides just so blatantly, opposing like this, because usually they don't sit down. And I'll give props to Piers on this one. He's actually quiet most of the part during this debate, which usually is not the case. So it's actually appreciated.
Piers,
okay, but Dave, let me ask you a difficult. Hang on, John. I will come to you. I just wanted to ask you, let's go back to the end of World War II, and the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in Japan, which obviously caused.
Yeah, wrong. Should not have happened. That's another one. People have an issue saying that. Yes, we should not have nuked 2 cities full of civilians. Shouldn't have done it. You can say they weren't nuclear warheads, they were atomic bombs, they were hydrogen bombs, whatever you want to say. We shouldn't have done it. No.
Huge loss of life. And I imagine by your criteria, that was a deliberate targeting of civilians. The argument in favor of doing it was that it brought...
I wonder what Piers means here by your criteria. That was literally the point, was to kill the morale of the Japanese people, or the Japanese military and the Japanese citizenship, to let them know that we're not screwing around. And it worked. Granted, it did work, but at the cost of that many civilians.
It brought an end to World War II and potentially saved millions more lives from being taken. In other words, there's your moral argument right there, is that you do this to stop this. You take this number of lives to stop many more lives being killed. I mean, when you look at that, for example, what's your view of that moral debate?
So, okay, well, first of all, just on the specifics, and we have talked about this before, but I tend to agree with 5-star General Dwight D. Eisenhower that it was unnecessary and wrong for us to drop the nuclear weapons. But regardless of that, even if 5-star General Eisenhower is wrong about that, and the other generals who supported it were right, this is exactly the point, Piers, is that when you start to think about war for what it actually is, what the overwhelming onus becomes clear. And the onus is on you to demonstrate that we absolutely have to do this. That the standard for war, when you're talking about intentionally killing innocent civilians, the standard ought to be, the burden should always be on you to demonstrate that we absolutely have to do this. I know this is horrible. I know what the result of this is, but that we have to do this because so much more human suffering would come from us not doing this. And this is, to me, the essence of the point of why I talk about war in this way, is that because if you don't think about it this way, it ends up being very easy to find other justifications, justifications like Hamas must go. Hamas must go. It's like, whoa, hold on, wait a second. I kind of think Hamas must go. I kind of think the Likud party must go. I definitely think Kim Jong-un must go. I kind of think Vladimir Putin must go. But that's not the standard for whether or not we're justified to just start slaughtering innocent people in the hope of achieving that end. What the standard ought to be is simply, do you absolutely have to do this, or there will be more human suffering? That should be the standard. And in the case of Israel-Gaza, I think that entirely changes the scope of things, because look, as all of us know, right? Gaza was, before October 7th, the most surveilled area in the world. Israel is the fortress of the world. It was a monumental failure of both policy and security for October 7th to have happened in the first place. And it's just not.
And the crazy thing to me is, one of the crazy things is that that's not even really debatable. Like, most people kind of accept, like, hey, Israel dropped the ball on that. The most obvious attack to happen, which is what Hamas did, and what Israel has openly been preparing for, and then they let their guard down and Hamas seized it. It's not even really debatable that Israel dropped the ball in that perspective.
Not the case that there's going to be October 7th after October 7th if Israel just stops now and leaves Gaza in the rubble mess that it is. And so that's exactly, like, I'm not I get your point, Piers, because you're almost going, wait, but if we follow this logic, then when could we ever fight a war? And essentially my point is that, right, yeah, the onus should be on anybody who wants to fight a war, ever. The onus should be on them to demonstrate that it is absolutely necessary and that there's nothing else we could do in this situation.
Okay, John, your response.
Piers, two UFC fighters enter a ring and one punches the other in the nose, and Dave says, how dare he punches him in the nose in this fight? That's the analogy. He's not making an appeal to facts, how the law of war works, how war works, whether it's the theory underneath the war or the actual framework to understand it. He doesn't like theory like just war theory, things like that, but the framework that is there. Now, he just said that one side has to show that there is a military necessity, he doesn't know these words, but that's what he's talking about, to actually enter the war. Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th.
I've never heard military necessity before. You blew my mind with your expertise.
Right,
yes.
I know. It's like you need, I'll give you war 101 offline. That's fine. Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th. Israel invoked Article 51, a self-defense war in accordance with the United Nations, again, more frameworks that people need to know, and said Hamas will be destroyed, removed from political power, and the hostages returned. Now, David said that's not necessary, and that all Israel needs to do is put more men on the wall. That's what Dave said.
He literally didn't say that. He didn't say that at all.
His solution, because he also doesn't study military theory on how do you win a war. He intermixes counterinsurgency theory with a war against removing a regime from power, defeating their military.
That's not.
Here's the other thing here. Israel isn't fighting a military. They are fighting an insurgency. It's kind of funny that Mr. Smartness over here, who's supposed to be like, the guy, doesn't understand that or is being willfully dishonest about it. I have a feeling he's being willfully dishonest. But they don't have an Air Force. They don't have a Navy. They don't have an Army. They don't have a Marines. It literally is an insurgent force.
This is
That's
what
not
Dave
what I was
isn't
doing.
making factual. You said that was exact words on Lex Freeman.
No.
He's not making an appeal to facts. I'm debating. He's making an appeal to emotion and morals, not what the law.
Morals. I'm making an appeal to logic and morals.
Hamas started a war on
And right there, there's another one. You just like it. Just the difference there is just deafening. You know, it's like John Speencer over here is like, oh well, he just makes an appeal to morals and logic. It's like, yes, correct.
October 7th, Hamas is going to lose a war, and it's going to never be in power again. It's never, and Hamas is the one that says they want to do October 7th. But Dave says, just put the wall up. They won't be able to do it on October 7th ever again, right? You have this blockade, although there was 100 tunnels going from Egypt to Gaza to build this military that Hamas built. And he'll say that Netanyahu sent him money. He's not making an appeal.
Wait.
The facts. This is
okay. So, factually, Netanyahu did send them money. That's not a secret. That is widely accepted. That is not a secret. And then John Speencer is going to turn around right after that and go, "Well, he's not making an appeal to fact. He says that Netanyahu sent Hamas money." It's like, yeah, that's fact. Yes, correct.
This is what we have a problem with Dave Smith. He makes an appeal to emotion and does historical revisionism, and he tells these narratives that aren't true.
Piers,
so his
can I just tell you, Piers?
Fails. He's anti-war.
What's so funny about this, Piers? Okay, what's so funny about this, Piers, is that after all of this, once again, all of this, I'm an expert, you don't know this, I'm an expert, you haven't studied military 101, then after all of that, the substance of what we're left with is, right, okay, got it. After all of that, the substance that we're left with is Hamas started the war on October 7th. Yes, the most basic point that every pro-Israel person has made on this show forever. That's what you've got here. Okay.
I got a fact.
It's
now
not
you want
a
to debate
fact.
the facts
It's not
of
a
how
fact.
Israel could achieve that goal.
By the way, you also don't even know what an appeal. It's not an appeal to emotion, by the way. That's not what it is. Although you do seem to be flirting with an appeal to authority.
Right?
No, it's an appeal to morality. For me to describe the actual human impact of what this policy is resulting in is not an appeal to emotion. I mean, like, it's an appeal to morality, and it's an appeal to logic. An appeal to logic. Look, you can't answer me this very simple question, okay? Here's the very simple question, okay? Which you'd have to admit, look, let's take the worst example, just not your example where there's a Hamas rocket firing at Israel.
Give me Gaza. Don't give me a hypothetical and the morals of the law of war. Give me
I was about to. If you interrupted me, I was on my way to. Let's say Israel targets an area where there are 2 combatants and 2 civilians. It's your 1-to-1 ratio, okay? And they decide that's acceptable by the international laws of war or whatever. By the way, in your appeal to the international laws, you didn't mention the ICC warrant for Netanyahu, which they don't seem to be respecting that much. But anyway, but we're still, you can still appeal to this framework even though they never have to live up to it. But let's just say, okay, the exact same action happened domestically. If someone were to do that, you would call it intentional murder, right? How does the concept of intentionality change because a politician uttered the word war, they declared it, and it's taking place in a foreign country? Without appealing to authority or appealing to law or appealing to what war normally is, can you as a human being explain to me how the concept of intentional changes magically because a politician uttered the phrase war?
Well, the thing about the politician, it's the framework. So yes, I can give you, and this is literally you're explaining in the question how you don't know how the framework of a war works. And
so teach me. Stop telling me I don't know. Stop telling me I don't know and demonstrate it. Teach me
I didn't say you don't know. Your question, I'll teach you something. Your domestic law has a complete societal agreement on what those laws will be adjudicated and how they'll be determined.
No, it doesn't.
How a criminal deterrence, absolutely, American law.
Lots of people don't agree to the law.
If you kill somebody, then you'll be convicted of a crime based on a jury and a judge, all this. Then you want to apply that on war, but then disregard what the laws of war, the things that all nations have agreed to on. This is how we account for intentionality.
You can't do it without making an appeal to the law. You can't do it. You can't explain it to me logically.
The body of laws have accounted for how do you get over that intentionality thing. If you
again in his appeal to the law there, he is, like Dave just pointed out, and I wish Dave would have really honed in on this more. The ICC has a warrant out for Netanyahu for what he's done in Israel. So where's the appeal to the law there? Why don't he bring that up? It's kind of inconvenient for his argument.
Use the same thing, which is when somebody says there's a war crime, or when you say Israel has intentionally targeted a civilian because, look, there's if you have to go to the statistical thing, we have issues unless you're doing comparative analysis. But if there's one combatant and one civilian, you don't know that, okay, what is that combatant? Is he a commander? Is he the commander?
Remember earlier when I was talking about how John Speencer there's arguing from the governmental point of view? He just explained it better than I could have. Like, hey, I know a civilian died, but was this guy a commander? Was he this? Was he that? It's like, the people on the ground, man, they don't care. Someone died who shouldn't have, who's around him. It's like,
is he a regular soldier? That accounts for what is the excessive collateral damage, and that's where intentionality gets into it. But, oh, by the way, what have you done to prevent it? In the domestic situation, you'd send the police to go get that criminal and then try them. In war, if you're a member of the other military in which I'm at war against, I don't have to have an excuse. I can kill you on sight.
Yeah, no,
okay,
I know.
very quickly,
Again,
before I let you...
Hang on,
Dave.
Yes, there are logistical differences. Sure.
Hang on, Dave. Hang on, Dave. Dave's going to stay with me when Eric wants. Hang on, guys. Hang on. John, we're going to let you go, John. Before we let you go, I want to ask you just one thing that also came out of the debate with Douglas and Dave, which was this issue of whether people who have what most people believe to be bad faith, deliberate conspiracy theory nonsense views. For example, Daryl Cooper saying Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Whether people like...
This angers me worse and worse every time. That is like a third of the phrase that was said. That is not the full phrase that was said.
Like Daryl Cooper should be platformed on gigantic podcasts like Joe Rogan or not, particularly if they're not going to be really vigorously challenged on what is something that to me is such an obviously untrue and offensive premise. What's your quick view of that?
I think that we should not platform historical revisionists who go.
Now these guys, it's like, oh, now we're talking about not platforming somebody because you don't agree with their opinion. Really? Like, and it's kind of odd for Piers Morgan to go for deplatforming somebody when his show is called Uncensored. Kind of hypocritical a little bit, don't you think?
Go back in time and find a fact and then tell it in a certain way to spin the narrative of what we should know about events. If you want to look at Daryl Cooper, look at the list of deleted tweets from Daryl Cooper. I'm against intellectually. Again, no expertise involved. Anybody can research whatever they want. If they come out with a new finding, that's great. Using evidence, using data, using a research.
Anybody can research what they want unless they disagree with me. Then you don't get to platform them.
Methodology. But no, you don't get to be a historical revisionist like Dave.
Actually, I do.
Okay, John Speencer, thank you very much indeed. Well, Dave, I'm going to let you respond, but with Eric. So,
all right, guys, that's the end of this debate between Speencer and Dave here. But yeah, the ending of that, I kind of forgot about that part. And I'm going to do a separate video on Piers Morgan arguing for deplatforming people, which he does heavily in this next part with Eric Weinstein. Yeah, I mean, John Speencer here used the same kind of debate tactics that Douglas Murray did. It didn't work out for him either. It's just, I don't know when these guys are going to learn. Like, you can't do the CNN-style debating on longer form podcasts, you know? Like, it just doesn't work out anymore. So, yeah, let me know what y'all think down below. Like, share, subscribe. Do everything you know you're supposed to do, and I'll catch y'all next time.